Well, one of the iconic images of the 60s was the what we call the natural, the fro,
Oh,
and,
yes.
and getting back to nature, connecting with the land. And a lot of people miss that part of that period in time. How did that aesthetic fit into that period?
Well, certainly it was there. There's some great pictures of Reverend Dr. Ben Chavis. Ben was the deputy executive director and then the executive director at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice when I worked there in 1986 and 1987 on this big foundational environmental justice research project that became the landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. But you'll see these iconic pictures of Ben. Well, Ben also was a member of the Wilmington 10, folks who are organizing in Wilmington, North Carolina to get Black people to vote at higher levels and be more engaged. And they were arrested and imprisoned and convicted for fomenting a riot, trying to get Black people to vote. And I think he was in prison for about 4 years. But when he was doing that organizing, he worked for the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, as did Andrew Young. When Andrew Young was working with Martin Luther King, Andrew Young was on the staff of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. So Andrew Young got paid whenever he got paid, but he got paid from the United Church of Christ, not the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And most people don't know that. But folks were on the ground in Warren County, North Carolina, which is that first county in North Carolina and the southwestern corner of North Carolina. When you're crossing the Virginia line into North Carolina, you cross into Warren County. They were throwing down against the siting of a hazardous waste landfill by the state of North Carolina, and they just broke out old school organizing. Right, they mobilized to keep the landfill from being built, to keep the state of North Carolina from turning their community into a hazardous waste site, to keep the trucks from rolling into this landfill with soil that was contaminated with PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. But they did the old school stuff, and they kept that at bay for 2 years. Eventually, they would lose that battle, but in the process, they would birth the what we know today as the environmental justice movement. Churches down there, the Black churches were the backbone of this organizing movement against this hazardous waste landfill. So, we stand on the foundation of the folks who fought this fight and fought it successfully before us.
Amen.
Right? But we looked around and we're like, the fight ain't over. Now, for me personally, what I took from all of this and this research we were doing at the United Church of Christ, the special project on toxic injustice, is that what people thought of as civil rights issues or racial justice issues, what we had always been fighting against, did not, in most people's minds, include environmental issues. And we came to realize through our research and the work of the church and other entities, other communities all over the country, that the fight is not over. Race is still the driving factor, undermining and devaluing the lives of Black and Brown and Indigenous people is manifested in where our country places most of the polluting facilities, the hazardous waste infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure. As my grandmother used to say, all the things that people don't want to live with are where Black people live. And she also said that we didn't need to spend the thousands of dollars that we spent doing that research, because any Black person could have told us that the hazardous waste is going to be where the Black people are. She said that straight out to me when I was trying to talk to her about this research. She says, yeah, y'all didn't need to spend that money. Any Black person in America could have told you that. My grandmother was a nurse. And I said, Grandma, as a scientist yourself, that 1,000 Black people, 100,000 Black people can say there's something funny about this water, right? Or we smell these strange odors every night when we go to sleep,
Yes.
right? Or there's a whole bunch of trucks rolling through our community at night, right? People could be saying that for years and years and years, but until somebody captures that in research and data, and then in a format in which it can be peer reviewed, and because that's the dominant culture, that's how we know something is real, not because it's happening to you every day in Chicago, but because somebody at the University of Chicago has written a study about it, right? And then it's real. But as long as Black people were saying something is terribly wrong where we live, something is terribly wrong with the conditions where we live, something is terribly wrong with the quality of the air that we're breathing. Lots of people are sick over here in this particular community or area. We could be saying that forever. But until there's research that's done that captures that lived experience, it's like it didn't happen. But there was also the issue, and it's certainly a prevalent issue in Chicago. It was the issue, it was one of the main issues around which People for Community Recovery in Altgeld Gardens on the south side of Chicago, it's one of the main issues that they organized around starting in 1979. They were and are one of the oldest environmental justice organizations in the nation. It's People for Community Recovery, founded by the late great Hazel Johnson. And
Yes.
yesterday was Hazel's birthday, and I understand they had quite the celebration to to lift her up and remember her birthday yesterday in Chicago. But they have been fighting lead poisoning forever, right? And why was it a particular issue for them? One, because it was so present in the public schools on the South Side,
Yes.
affecting Black children, right? But it was also present in the public housing where they lived at Altgeld Gardens. But even bigger than that, they lived next to major paint manufacturers that were almost adjacent to their community, and they were still making lead-based paint. So they were manufacturing lead-based paint. So they were being exposed triply to the impacts of lead and paint. And so they worked, the National Environmental Organizations worked on getting lead out of gasoline. And we still thank them for that, right? But they didn't look at lead in paint. They didn't look at lead in housing. They didn't look at how the lead was being dispersed in the exhaust of trucks and buses and cars, and would disperse at the ground level in the communities where all this traffic was going through. We live near the highways, right? So there was lead in the soil. There was lead in the parks. There was lead in the paint that they were using in people's houses. We live in Chicago, they live next to the manufacturing of the paint. So, but nobody said this is a critical issue. Just the end of last year, United States Environmental Protection Agency, rolled out a new lead and copper rule to really, really significantly reduce the level at which the presence of lead will trigger action, or should trigger action, but also removing all the lead and copper pipes that deliver drinking water. All lead pipes are being removed according to EPA. But that's an issue that environmental justice folks put on the table. So when I tell you that we are organizing and we are working on changing public policy, that's what I mean, right? And some of us are in the rooms where this rulemaking is happening. Where do we learn that? We learn that from our brothers and sisters that made law and policy in the 50s and 60s, right? And sometimes they litigated those issues. Sometimes it was a public policy campaign. Sometimes it was an organizing campaign, plus public policy, plus research, plus litigation, right? That was Brown versus Board of Education. All of that was going on for Brown versus Board of Education. So I hope we learn that lesson well, that you got to fight on multiple fronts in order to change the conditions that we still find ourselves living in.
Man, beautiful. So now lead pipes are still an issue, particularly here in Chicago. I think we're like #1 in lead pipes in the country. But of course, that's all superseded now by the climate crisis. And so how do we now bring that to the forefront, particularly for our communities?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because I want to say that it is no accident that we live in the places that are the most vulnerable to climate change to begin with, right? So it's a big issue for us, but we can't forget about the other issues. And I'm a little concerned that funders, government, academia, and some environmental organizations are focusing laser-like on the climate change issue. And that's really important because, if we don't address this or stop the rapid, rise of sea level and all the ways that that's impacting human habitability and ecosystems, if we don't figure out what we can do to stop that, we are all doomed. And that's just a fact, right? But in the meantime, I would like not to be drinking water that's contaminated with lead. In the meantime,
yes.
In the meantime, I would like to be able to go outside my house and sit on my steps or sit in my backyard or sit on my stoop if I was home in Harlem and be able to stay out there for more than 5 minutes before I'm hacking and coughing and wheezing because the quality of the air is so poor and the volume of traffic that's moving through my community is so high, right? In the meantime, I'd like to be able to go to the store and get quality food and not have to go to the neighboring white community. Our position is, as a movement, the environmental justice movement, first of all, the Constitution says that we are entitled to equal protection under the law. Everybody. Doesn't say only white people. It doesn't say only white people of a certain income level. It says everyone is to be treated equally before the law. It's called the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Most of our civil rights statutes at the state level or at the federal level derive from the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And all we have ever said, just treat me the same way you treat every damn body else.
So tell us about Title VI.
So first of all, folks should, if you want to really understand public policy, or if you have any curiosity about political science, public policy, and how you address racism in the form of law and statute, you should read the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It is a beautifully crafted, beautifully written, expansively designed. So people keep coming back to different aspects of the Civil Rights Act, right? So anti-discrimination based on age is predicated on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Anti-discrimination or discrimination based on gender is addressed within the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Anti-discrimination based on limited English proficiency, that English is not your primary language, is addressed within the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And of course, anti-discrimination or discrimination in education, in public accommodations, in housing, right? Well, the Fair Housing Act also speaks much more directly to that, but that is where you find the foundation of all of that policy and all of that work that we're still doing today is in the Civil Rights Act. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says that you cannot be the recipient of federal financial assistance and use that money in a way that discriminates against protected groups of people as defined in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So if Illinois gets a grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation to fix its roads, it can't just use that money, that federal money, in the suburbs of Chicago and not use it in the Black communities on the west and south side of Chicago. But that is what happens, though, right? Or that is what has happened historically. If you get money to do anything in your hospital from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but you really spiff up the municipal hospitals that service a majority white clientele, but not the hospitals that service a Black patient clientele, that is a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Now, you often have to do some investigation. A community or an entity has to file a complaint, and then an investigation is done. And you do not have to prove that the discrimination was intentional. You just have to prove that you got $1 federal, but you spent 75 cents of that federal dollar on white folks, where you should have spent it equitably on all communities, right? for whatever the program was. That does not happen. It's a violation of the law, but it takes a lot to pursue those cases, but people are doing it. And the other great thing about Title VI is if they find that you have discriminated in the use and expenditure of those federal dollars, they can ask for the money back. And I love that part. They do something called a performance partnership agreement. So they enter into these cooperative agreements, or delegated authority is what it's really called. And delegated authority means that all the authority that I have as a federal agency, I delegate to you as a state agency to enforce on our behalf. So I delegate to the state of Illinois Department of Natural Resources the authority to enforce the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and on and on and on and on and on. And that delegated authority often transfers with grants, federal grants that come from the U.S. Department of U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or HHS, or the Department of the Interior, or the Department of Transportation, whomever, right? In those agreements, at least from EPA, it is in the agreement, either the governor signs it or the secretary of the state agency. It says that you will enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and they sign their name. That's a contractual agreement that they have signed with the federal government. It's a whole bunch of stuff in that agreement, and you're signing it, and it says, I'm going to do X and Y, and as a result of agreeing to that, we get this money. It's usually multi-millions of dollars. Right now, there's so much money flowing out the federal government to state agencies and to local groups, and we've not seen this amount of federal appropriations and infrastructure money and energy money and transportation money. We've not seen anything like this in our lifetimes. But so people are signing a lot of agreements. But in those agreements, there's a codicil that says you will enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. In other words, you will spend this money equitably. That has not been happening. And EPA and other agencies have not been holding these agencies to account. So we are saying it's straight up discrimination. This is not complex, right? Some environmental issues can be really hard because of the science to determine how are people being disproportionately impacted, right? In a given geographic area, how can you say that people of color are being more impacted by exposure to pollution than others? That takes some doing to be able to prove that, but we have been able to prove it time and time again. But on the question of, you got this money and you're supposed to spend it equitably across all populations, but you're not, clearly. We see these people still got all these lead service drinking lines, but other people got really modern drinking water, municipal drinking water systems. What happened here? Right? We've been asking those questions for a long time, but now we've gotten a lot more sophisticated, and we have a lot more lawyers, and there's a whole ton of really great lawyers in Chicago, environmental lawyers, who are working on this. But the thing used to be that the environmental folks didn't see civil rights issues at all, or civil rights law. And the civil rights folks didn't see environmental law, right? And here we were with these two very, very dynamic social movements, but nobody was looking at the intersection of civil rights, racial justice, and environmental discrimination or environmental exposure. So that's what we brought to the table.
How do you see this red-blue dynamic that's impacting a lot of the decision-making, and the impact it's going to have on this flood of money that's coming out of the federal government right now?
Well, people really have to put themselves in different spaces and different rooms. One of the things I love about the work of Blacks in Green is that you all have been working on the energy sector and energy justice issues for a long time at the state level. And we have got to show up and be active and sit at the tables where a lot of this decision-making is happening, particularly with state agencies. And the reason that I say that is because a lot of this money is all of it is federally appropriated money. And many of the ways that the money flows is it flows from Congress approves it, the president signs it, then it comes in the form of various programs and appropriations and funding in the budgets of federal agencies, right? And then the federal agencies with these performance partnership agreements, that's what EPA calls them. I don't know what other federal agencies call them, but they then distribute that money to state agencies by law and by statute to identify and prioritize what are the things that we're going to spend this money on. But we're usually never in those rooms where the conversation is happening about what things are priorities. And that's one of the things that we're all in the environmental justice movement focused on now is equity in how that money is appropriated, particularly infrastructure money, right? Modernization of transportation. So there's lots of projects going on. I'm sorry to say that the downside of the spending of all this money is that all our roads are going to be torn up for a long time as states figure out what projects they need to do. But how about making sure, and the federal government has determined, the Biden administration has put forward a policy called Justice 40. And Justice 40 says that 40% of a lot of that infrastructure money has got to be spent in disadvantaged, marginalized, environmentally overburdened, environmental justice communities, right? Well, who's going to make that determination? Mostly your state agencies are going to make that determination. Are you in the room with them? Are you sitting on the advisory boards with them? Are you going to the public meetings? Are you providing public comment? If need be, are you talking to some legal advocates to challenge some of the decisions that are being made? That's where we got to be, right? So people say live a healthier lifestyle, but we're going to keep permitting all these facilities that are adversely impacting the quality of the air you breathe. But you should do what you can to live a healthier lifestyle. Those two things are just do not mesh up. And so we are demanding this conversation at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level about cumulative impact. Stop with the permits. Stop, right? Or here's another thought. If you can't bring yourself to stop permitting these facilities, here's a thought. Build them where you live. If they're so safe,
yes.
If they're so benign, build them where you live.
All right now.